and in a way, like, if you think about humanity, which is one of my kind of, I guess, mythological ideas in the book, as essentially we don't recognize it, but we actually are a planetary superorganism that exists in a symbiotic relationship with the Earth's ecology as a whole system. And already our world is marked far more by cooperation than it is by competition. So for instance, like, to drink this cup of coffee, the cup was probably made in China, the beans are from Africa, the milk is probably from, England, the fuel was from Russia. I mean, the whole world is one system that works to get something like this into your hands. I mean, that's really extraordinary. And we don't even think about that. It's the same way our body, has all these things going on that we would have to think about. It's just being done for us, But then, because we've been in a very quick historical process, right? Like, we didn't have industrial technology 250 years ago. This is like brand new for us. It's like 6 generations that's even had this, and our ability to extract resources and build these systems and so on has been developing at such a ferocious rate. We need to step back and we need to think about it a little bit. Like, what is a corporation? One idea I suggest in the book is that, once again, thinking about this idea of humanity as a planetary superorganism, like, what are the organs of the collective body of humanity? In a strange way, I think that multinational corporations are like those nascent organs. So for instance, like, an energy company is kind of like the blood that's circulating, the energy through the system. A media company is kind of like the perceptual mechanisms that's taking in raw data and converting it into kind of memes, ways that the whole body then kind of reacts and acts together. A sanitation company is like the liver or the kidney that's like breaking stuff down and so on. So, but the problem is that, in this brief historical period that we're in, this sort of economic system has developed in a certain way through a kind of inertia, right? So in a sense, a corporation is like an artificial life form, and we inject it into this game that we've created called the stock market, and we give it certain rules as to how this artificial life form has to survive in this game, and we tell it the only way to survive is to maximize shareholder value, to make more monetary value. So that's what the corporation is forced to do. So then when you think about a company like British Petroleum, destroying the Gulf of Mexico because they were evading, environmental, codes and so on, that's just in the DNA of the game that we've constructed for the corporations. But we constructed that game. Like, in theory, we can construct a different game. We can take these artificial life forms and we can turn them more into cooperative infrastructures, that have as their mandate, protecting the community of life, localizing, returning value to local communities. I mean, that's totally possible. It's just that we haven't figured out, how to get control of the system that we've unleashed, and probably we need a crisis of this magnitude to open up the space for that to be possible, to be something that people will consider throughout the whole system. The collective consciousness is shaped by governing mythologies that we don't even recognize are mythologies. So, for instance, the sort of reductive Darwinian idea of the survival of the fittest is one that is popularly used, and now kind of like a crude application of evolutionary biology has been picked up by some of these right-wing people, like so. But I think you can, there's different ways to look at things, and you can actually construct better myths that totally correspond to the reality that we share, that help people to see it differently and embody it differently. So for instance, like I would say that the idea of the survival of the fittest, that it's a ruthless competition, for life, is actually not what the evidence seems to show when you look at what epigeneticists are discovering and so on. And actually the new model is more that what marks evolution most is symbiosis and cooperation, and competition and aggression are smaller aspects that ultimately cooperation outcompetes competition ultimately. And a great example of that, of course, is our own bodies, right? Like, our bodies are 10 trillion microorganisms, tens of trillions of cells and microorganisms that somehow, during earlier periods of crisis in the planet's, ecological or the planet's evolution, they figured out how to work together to create more complex structures. like eyes and hearts and so on. In a way, these recent political events have kind of kicked the ecological subject kind of off the front page and even out of a lot of people's psyches, but it's still kind of like the underlying kind of drumbeat of our time, I would say, is what's happening with species extinction and climate change and ocean acidification and stuff like that. So, so just my background a little bit. I'm from New York City and from a kind of bohemian background. My father was an abstract painter, and my mother was a writer and a book editor. She was also involved with the Beat generation in the 50s and 60s. She actually, she went out with the writer Jack Kerouac, who wrote On the Road, and she was with him when his masterpiece was published, and saw it actually kind of destroy him in a way because he was sort of an alcoholic. So I came from this kind of bohemian cultural background. My parents were not into anything spiritual or religious or mystical. They'd rejected kind of all of that, and I had to rediscover that for myself when I went through a kind of existential emergency in my late 20s. And it's actually kind of fun. I have one friend here, Adrian, who I know he's sitting over there, who I knew from before the existential emergency, when I was kind of more immersed in New York art and literary worlds, and working as a journalist and a magazine editor, and really wanting to be like a poet and a novelist and so on. What is the meaning of it all? And I remembered psychedelic experiences from college as being kind of profound catalytic events in my life. And even though they were kind of ridiculed and suppressed in that culture, that in New York and so on, I decided to make that a subject of investigation, and I ended up going to West Africa and to visiting a tribe called the Bwiti and going through an initiation, taking a substance called iboga, which is a very long-lasting psychedelic substance. And I went and visited a tribe in Ecuador taking ayahuasca. I visited a culture in Mexico, the Maztecs in Oaxaca, which is where we rediscovered the psilocybin mushrooms in the 50s. I also wrote about the Burning Man Festival. I discovered this kind of like psychedelic renaissance that was happening in the West Coast, and in kind of the different scenes of younger people all around the world. And so, but the course of writing that book and going through those different initiation experiences ultimately shifted my worldview from starting out as a scientific materialist and kind of a skeptic to having all these different psychic experiences that I recount in those books, where ultimately I ended up shifting from kind of Freudian materialist worldview to a Jungian worldview, to a realization that there are these many dimensions of the psyche, and that then our scientific culture has really allowed us to think or explore. And along the way, I began to learn about prophecies that different cultures have about this time, like the Mayan civilization, which had a long count calendar that ended a 5,125-year cycle in 2012. And Hopi prophecies. Hopi are the original dwellers in the American continent, in Arizona, and they talk about this time as transition from the fourth world to the fifth world. So a lot of my second book was really focused on, how could we understand what these indigenous cultures say about the time that we're in. I mean, having had this shift, going from the scientific, materialist, skeptical worldview to having so many experiences with shamanic cultures and even kind of, telepathic experiences, synchronistic experiences, shamans, accessing information, somehow even more occult experiences that I recount in the book. I felt that we needed to take the knowledge of these cultures more seriously and find a way to kind of articulate them in our own way of thinking and knowing. So I ended up looking at a lot of philosophers like Heidegger and Nietzsche, and thinkers like Carl Jung and Rudolf Steiner, and kind of integrating them. So it wasn't that I thought that 2012 was going to be by itself like a catalytic or catastrophic or amazing, anything was going to particularly happen, at that time, but more like, these larger dynamics of transformation were underway, and somehow these cultures understood something very significant about our time. And I was left finishing that book, and I guess I would say that the understanding the ecological crisis as one of the things that really points towards this being a time when humanity is confronted with a choice, and ultimately, within the lifetimes of most of us in this room, is going to have to make a choice, choose a direction in a way, and then also seeing how technology had evolved to create something like the internet, which in a way is creating something like a global brain, so that humanity is now meshed together in a way through instantaneous networks of communication that really could be the support infrastructure if we did want to change as a species and shift in a different direction. And then also noting that not only was the rediscovery of ayahuasca and Amazonian shamanism happening, but also all these different esoteric traditions, like Eastern traditions, like Tibetan Buddhism, and yoga and Sufism and Kabbalah and so on. They were all becoming more accessible to people. And actually, whereas the religions always seem to be in conflict, if you went into the esoteric traditions, they really seem to work together quite well, just sort of different articulations of a similar kind of philosophy. And not only that, that esoteric philosophy feels like it's less and less in contradiction to a scientific worldview, to the understanding of quantum physics, the realization that kind of like maybe there's an underlying consciousness, or maybe we're all aspects of this underlying consciousness that may work in different ways from what we understand through our limited evidence of our sense perceptions and so on. So I felt, though, as I finished that book, and each of the books that I wrote was really kind of given, the birth of it was like a profound question or set of questions that I felt like I couldn't find an answer to. So whether it was really trying to understand why was the visionary experience of plant teachers like ayahuasca and iboga and peyote so rigorously like suppressed and ridiculed by our culture and like shut out. That was kind of the question of the first book. The question of the second book was then, having realized how valuable and valid those experiences were, why had we suppressed all this indigenous knowledge and not even taken seriously their way of understanding this time that we're in. And then the third book followed from that. It's like, okay, if we are in this prophetic time and we're presented with a kind of choice as a species, then what is our alternative? What is our option? Like, let's say, somehow we were to make use of this time, of the networks of communication we have, of the opportunities we have, to construct a what I talk about in the book as a regenerative culture, a new planetary culture, a regenerative society that where we somehow aimed to come together as one to make a world that would work for everybody, into the long-term future, and also somehow protect and help the community of life, which we're now kind of at odds with, and in a way kind of desecrating. And so to do that, so I guess in a way, like what I've done is sort of try to be like a systems thinker, like sort of very influenced by Buckminster Fuller. People here read Buckminster Fuller at all? Cool. Yeah, so like particularly little books that he wrote, like Utopia or Oblivion, which he wrote in the 60s, or Operation Spaceship Earth. And Buckminster Fuller really saw at that time that, technically, humanity had the capacity to make the world work for everybody. There were enough resources to go along and around as long as they weren't squandered. We have a technical genius, we have the creative capacity, but we were obstructed, by our political ideologies, our economic systems. They were blocking us from doing what needed to be done. So yeah, I guess in the book I tried to kind of say, all right, like let's look at this, let's step back, almost like we're an alien, from another world. Let's look at what's happening on Earth and think about it in these very large, level of like systems, dynamics, and so on. And from that perspective, I offer some theories or ways of thinking about this time, or in a way you could say like, adulthood. Myths. And if you look at tribal societies around the world, they have initiation rites, and once again, because we've kind of dismissed the value of those cultures, we don't really think about those initiation rites as that important, but it is very interesting that modern civilization is basically the first that doesn't have anything like that. In these other cultures, indigenous cultures, like, there's a walkabout, or, to become an adult, you have to go through some kind of ordeal, some kind of, it could be a Sundance, or it could be drinking ayahuasca or taking iboga. And maybe instead of those just being kind of cultural markers, they actually have a deeper function, almost like a neurophysiological function. Because as human beings, like, we have a part of the brain, like the prefrontal cortex, which just developed in the last 100,000 years, And that's the part of our brain that makes us distinctly human, that allows us to like process abstract symbols, to plan for the future and so on. But it also alienates us and separates us, from other people and from the natural world. And so without a kind of initiation, something that pushes us beyond our limits and into a kind of visionary state or transpersonal state, it's maybe the problem is that we get locked into a kind of ego consciousness, and we don't really come to think of ourselves as maybe members of a larger whole, or aspects of, in a tribal scenario, it would be aspects of a tribe. In our global civilization, it would be, maybe aspects of a planetary ecology, So if we were to think about ourselves in those terms, then we would also think about our whole situation differently, and it would become obvious to us the types of changes that we need to make in our systems. So in the book, I kind of like, the way I look at it is there's the technical infrastructure, and then there's the political and economic systems, the social systems, and then there's the consciousness that we have, which is, in a way, as one Marxist, post-Marxist philosopher, Antonio Negri talks about, that he talks about the idea of the production of subjectivity, that we don't actually think about it, but subjectivity itself is something that's very much produced by culture and by media and so on. And this is becoming, I think, very, very clear now in the US, where you have, tens of millions of people who've been kind of like hypnotized in a way by right-wing media, by Fox and Breitbart and so on. And and this media is carefully constructed so that when people begin to think in those terms, they actually feel that, oh, I'm a rebel, I'm an individual, I've broken through this kind of liberal crap, and now I'm free to to recognize that men are stronger than women, and minorities maybe have to be put in their place and so on. But they don't realize that the subjectivity that they've adapted is actually something that's been constructed for them. And it's really true, I think. In a way, that's what culture is and does. Like Terence McKenna talked about how culture is our operating system, So there's three levels that I look at in the book. The technical level is things like, the industrial system and the energy system and the agriculture system, right? And how those would have to change if we wanted to have a regenerative system, if we wanted to have an enduring, an enduring society on the planet. So for instance, like we know that agriculture in the current form is depleting the world's topsoil. Like according to the UN, there's only 60 years left of harvests at the way we're depleting all the topsoil. But we also know there are other practices which are called like regenerative agriculture or no-till agriculture or organic that actually replenish topsoil. So that would be, we would need to make a global shift to regenerative farming practices. We would need to radically reduce the amount of meat that we're consuming as a species, because that has a terrible impact on the climate in so many ways.